Hi everyone, I wanted to show you a fun beach cookie to make and also show you some new techniques that you might not have seen before. So we're going to start off by touching down our piping bag to the cookie. We're going to squeeze a little bit of icing out to attach it, and then we're going to lift our bag up and go across the cookie here. I want a wavy line, I don't want a straight line across. This is going to be our C, so we don't want it nice and even. And then again, anytime you're attaching your icing either to the cookie or to the previous pipe line, you want to touch down your piping bag so you connect that icing. My outline dry for a minute or two and come back and flood it here. If you need a good icing recipe, I will link one down below, the one that I use for everything, and I have also lots of tips in there as well. So here I'm taking my time. I'm trying to half flood over my outline. So if you see, I'm not putting the tip on top of the outline, just right beside it, but I'm pushing on the bag so that there's enough icing coming out that it's going to sort of cover that outline there. Every time you see me stop and move my tip around in the icing, sometimes I put too much pressure on that one spot. And so I'm trying to smooth out the icing a little bit because it's not quite coming out of the bag because it's sort of backing up into the bag. So if you're not moving fast enough or you're putting too much pressure in one spot, then it will kind of come back in, not quite back into your bag, but it'll block the icing from coming out. So if you have a hard time with that, that's why. And then here, while the icing is still wet, I'm going to add a few white lines here. This is with my flood icing, my white flood. So we want the same consistency here so that they sort of melt into each other. These are going to be the waves, the little white caps in the water. So I'm just taking my scribe and just mixing it in a little, just to, separate that line up a bit, just to make it more like a water kind of texture. And then I'm going to set this aside to dry. We want to at least crust it over so that it doesn't mix in with our next icing. So here we're going to do the sandy beach part. So I'm again outlining with my outline consistency. This is a thicker consistency. This will hold in my flood. I don't need to outline the part next to the blue. I'm going to just flood up right into that blue. So I'm just pushing nice and steadily, and I'm letting the icing do the work up against that outline of the blue. And I always take my time around the edges. We don't want to flood too much, or too much over the outline because I don't want it spilling on the side of my cookie. And then I'm just going to fill a little bit in here, and I'm going to spread it out with my scribe. You can also use a little paintbrush for this part or a spoon. And if you need to add more icing, you can. I will have to do that in a little bit. And the reason why I'm not flooding it completely is because we're going to cover this with cookie crumbs in a little bit. And if I flood it too much, what happens when I put the cookie crumbs on top is that it's going to spread that icing over the edges. And that's what I don't want, so I want to make sure that there's not too much icing here. I'm just going to add a little bit more icing here just to be able to cover the whole cookie here so that the cookie crumbs have something to stick to. You can use graham cracker crumbs like I'll be using, or you can actually grate an extra cookie that you have and use that as well. And we're just going to sprinkle some of these cookie crumbs on top here while the icing is still wet so that they'll stick nicely. We don't have to worry about the blue part getting covered because the icing has crusted over, it's dried to the touch. So we won't stick to that. So that's why we dried the blue part first, because I didn't want to get any of the sand in the sea. And now we're going to add some sandals here, some flip-flops. So I have my outline consistency pink. So you can see it's thick and it's taking me a little bit of wiggling of the icing tip in the icing to smooth it out. And then I'm going to go in with my scribe to smooth it out further. Whenever you have thicker icing like this in small areas, you can add quite a bit so it's nice and fluffy. And it's much easier to thin out with your scribe or smooth out with your scribe. So you can see me kind of building up the icing there, and I'm jiggling it as long. Now the reason I'm doing it this way is because it's easier for me to make it bigger or smaller or shape it a little bit with my scribe. Whereas if I did an exact outline and let that outline dry, I wouldn't be able to shape it and make it, if the right one is bigger than the left one, I can fix the left one a little bit and so on. So here I'm just using my scribe to make them as even as possible. And also it helps to smooth it out. And then while those dry, I'm going to go on and do the shore waves. So here I'm adding my flood icing and then just taking a small paintbrush and pulling it back. I don't want to pull back right from the front of the edge. I want to sort of leave like a bumper or sort of amount of icing at the very, very edge. And then I'm pulling it back, and you can go over and over. This is flood, so what happens is that it kind of melts back together. So I'm spreading the icing out, and I'm also, if a lot of it gets onto my paintbrush, I will wipe it off with a damp paper towel. And we're going to do one section at a time here. And you can always go back to, if it's still, your little marks with the paintbrush are not staying, you can go over it a few times. If you use an outline consistency, sometimes it's too thick to be able to spread, so I like to use my flood for this. I have used my outline before, and it depends. If it's really stiff, it's not going to work well. If it's on the more looser end of outline consistency, it works a little bit better. But again, sometimes your flood is really loose, so we kind of have to play with it a little bit here. I could have made a sort of in-between consistency, but this is such a small little area, and this was the only one I'm making like this. If I was making a whole set, I might have had made a consistency that's kind of in between my flood and my outline, so that when I put my paintbrush through, it kind of holds the outline, but it's still loose enough to spread out. But again, if your icing isn't perfect, there's ways to work around it. So here you see me going back and forth, kind of making those ripples again in the water. And as the icing dries a little bit, it's going to start to keep its shape. And we just continue along the whole line here, along the seam between the brown and the blue, to make those nice kind of shore waves washing up on the beach. So this cookie shows you a little bit of wet on wet technique. Okay, now we're going to go back to the sandals now that they've crusted over. And I'm going to put a little dot here and use my black outline icing and to connect to the dot and back to the other side, just to make it look like a pair of flip-flops. And there you go, we have a fun beach cookie. Hope you learned something new. Make sure you check out the next video, and don't forget to subscribe. Happy baking!